Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since joining the Department on the 27th of July, I've personally met over 20 business organisations, and since July 2016, the Department for Exiting the European Union ministers have collectively undertaken over 700 meetings with businesses and business organisations from every sector in the economy.
Andrew Lewer.
Northamptonshire is one of the most important logistics hubs in the UK, so what steps is the Department taking to make sure that those firms and businesses are up and ready to deal with a possible no-deal Brexit?
That's a very sensible question. The Department has engaged extensively with logistics companies and representative bodies from across the sector to ensure they're prepared for the 31st of October. And I would encourage the Honourable Member and businesses to consult the public information campaign gov.uk to get practical step-by-step guide on what is required for business. That is a powerful thing to do. That's the right thing to do in preparing to leave properly on the 31st of October.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. What information can the Minister give us about what preparation has been done, what proactive contact his department has made with those businesses who may not directly trade with Europe but whose supply chains or customers do, and who may not therefore have availed themselves of the government pages?
Minister.
I would certainly specifically encourage those businesses to avail themselves of that opportunity. The Department sent out 1,300 bits of information that's captured on the gov.uk website. I've engaged with businesses, in particular I'm the SME champion for the Department, but the one thing that I have noticed, and I would share with honourable members, is larger businesses do tend to be more prepared than smaller businesses, particularly the type of which she speaks, and the departmental website is, or sorry, the government website is a rich source of information, so I would encourage members to return to their constituency and, alongside campaigning, promote the government website.
Gregory Campbell.
Mr. Speaker, there's a massive differentiation between some of the realistic concerns that businesses have about a no deal and some of the madcap scare stories that are going around. What is the Minister doing to ensure there is an understanding of realistic concerns and dismissing some of those other wild stories?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There will always be knockabout politics. I would prefer to engage in the detail. I was in Northern Ireland last Thursday talking to businesses on the border and then in Belfast discussing around alternative arrangements, discussing with a wide range of business, engaging in the very real detail and not the high-level scare stories. There are concerns, they're being dealt with, but they shouldn't be confused with the bigger scare stories.
Number 7.
You stay.
I've had extensive discussions, Mr. Speaker, over the summer recess with European counterparts. I suspect the right honourable gentleman and I have seen a little less of summer than some. In the last fortnight, that's included in Paris, Copenhagen, Helsinki, and a couple of other places. So there's been extensive engagement, and that engagement continues.
Mr. Philip Dunn.
I'm very encouraged to hear my right honourable friend begin to list some of his summer itinerary. I think it would help build confidence that the government is engaged in serious discussions with the EU Commission and other counterparts. And to that effect, would he be prepared to publish whom he has met, the discussions that he's had when not in meetings, with whom and when?
I would just say that I'm sure that the unknown place to which the right honourable gentleman has referred has not forgotten that the Secretary of State visited it and its inhabitants. Secretary of State.
I fear I may get in trouble for the said unknown place, but I hope it'll be the latitude will be granted. My right honourable friend raises actually a very material point, because it goes to the crux of the debate last night as to the sincerity of the negotiations, and there's also been extensive contact by the Prime Minister through the G7, through his visits to Berlin and Paris, amongst others, through the extensive work to which I pay huge tribute of the European advisor to the Prime Minister, who has been in Brussels this week, and again has travelled extensively. So significant work has been going on. And very happy to look at what further detail we can set out.
Jenny Chapman.
Yeah. Well, if all that's true, why did Dominic Cummings call the negotiations a sham?
So, well, firstly, as she well knows, the government don't comment on leaks, and But secondly, the issue really is looking at the substance. Look at the letter from President Tusk to President Tusk that narrows the issues down. Now, it would have been much easier for the Prime Minister to have set out a long list of demands. But because of the seriousness of the negotiation, those have been narrowed down as set out in that letter. One of the charges from the European Union to the previous government, I apologise to the Honourable Lady, one of the charges at the previous government was it hadn't been specific enough as to what sort of future relationship was sought in the political declaration. It's answered that question very clearly with a best-in-class FTA, and that doesn't just cover the economic side, that's also looking at the security side and other aspects. So the point is, there is substance there. The problem on the other side is they don't want to leave at all, and therefore they won't take yes for an answer.
Adrian Bailey.
Number 8, Mr. Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, I'll group questions 8 and 12 together. I spoke to the Home Secretary this week on matters relating to security and to the Policing Minister as well, relating to us exiting the European Union. The Department has exiting European Union ministers and officials that hold regular meetings with the Home Office, and we're working closely to prepare for business, keeping our plans under rigorous review, and I will continue to do so.
Bailey.
Under a no-deal Brexit, UK police would lose access to 40 enforcement tools, including the European arrest warrant and access to European information databases vital for identifying international terrorists and criminals that could be targeting this country. Can he explain how that is assisting us to take back control of our borders?
Well, one thing that would certainly assist is 20,000 extra police officers. I challenge the Honourable Member. But getting down to the specifics, I did want to make a political point. You'll forgive me for making a political point, given we're into an election, or certainly we think we're into an election. But on the specific details, so Interpol notices function very similar to SIS. To the Honourable Gentleman reasonably talks of the European arrest warrant. In the event that we leave without a deal, the UK will operate the Council for European Convention on Extradition with EU member states. And we've worked intensively with operational partners both here and across the EU to ensure that there's a smooth transition between the two.
Jack Dromey.
Mr. Speaker, Operation Yellowhammer found, and I quote, that a no-deal Brexit could lead to a rise in public disorder and community relations. Does the government not recognise that the toxic and irresponsible use of language like collaborators, treachery, surrender, deepens the divisions in our country, puts the public at risk, including members of this House? Have the government not learnt the tragic lessons of history?
Minister.
Can I gently say to the Honourable Gentleman, one thing that will lead to unrest and unhappiness is the public and the referendum result being ignored. But we continue to work with the police and army in the normal way.
Mr. Bob Neal.
Number 9, sir.
Minister Dudridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking my honourable friend, who I don't seem to see in the chamber. He is. I apologise, Mr. Speaker. It was in no way an insult to his height or presence. I was going to congratulate on his work on the Justice Select Committee. The government is committed to maintaining over time, growing the United Kingdom's 4.4 billion trade service in legal services, and this includes setting the right framework under future trade negotiations.
Mr. Robert Neal.
There's always more than one way to be overlooked. Does the Minister accept that at the moment the United Kingdom has the second largest market in legal services in the world and the largest in the European Union? That is itself because of the unparalleled access which British lawyers currently have into EU legal markets under the appropriate directives. Does the Minister recognise that if we are to avoid the 10% hit that the Law Society estimates would occur in the event of a no-deal Brexit to the income to this country of British legal services, it is important that we preserve the maximum access to those markets, but also have a comprehensive strategy across all departments to market British legal services as a world centre of excellence elsewhere?
I fully agree with the honourable gentleman. 6.5% of global legal services pass through the United Kingdom. 3 out of 15 top firms are based internationally in the UK. It's essential we work on a cross-departmental basis, and the Legal Services Great Campaign is a good example of this ambitious programme. And since its launch in Singapore in October 2017, it's campaigned in over 30 countries with transmissions to Kazakhstan, China, Chile and Nigeria. These will continue and they are very effective.
Ellie Reeves.
Question number 10.
Minister Doddridge.
The European Union has confirmed that it will grant UK nationals visa-free travel to the Schengen area for short stays of up to 90 days in any 180-day period, even in a no-deal scenario. In the event of no deal, UK nationals, when travelling to the European Union, that will change, and we've published advice on gov.uk on the steps that UK nationals will need to take.
Ellie Reeves.
Many EU nationals in Lewisham, Western Penge have endured incredible stress and anxiety over the uncertainty that they've faced since the referendum. Their rights have been used as a bargaining chip with the EU, and the new Home Secretary even proposed legislation to stop freedom of movement immediately after no deal. So will the Minister today give us his assurances that citizens' rights will no longer be used as a negotiating tool and will be unilaterally guaranteed?
Well, citizens' rights will not be used as a negotiating tool. They have not been used as a negotiating tool, and the honourable member mischaracterises the position. It is the Prime Minister that has made a big, bold offer to EU citizens. It's now for member states to reciprocate.
Oh, very well. Ruth George.
Thank you. What assessment has the government made of the impact on people with pre-existing health conditions who no longer can use the European health insurance cards to cover their conditions if they either now live in the EU or are travelling?
Minister.
Well, this will depend on decisions and arrangements with individual companies, and I would encourage them to reciprocate the big, bold offer that the UK have made to EU nationals in the United Kingdom.
Paul Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I welcome the Minister to his place. He will know that over the summer recess, a Home Office advert on settled status was banned for being misleading. Now, the uncertainty created by these conflicting messages is causing real fear among EU citizens in the UK and the British in Europe. So I wrote to the Secretary of State on the 21st of August seeking clarity on 5 key issues. I've not had a reply, so I wonder if the Minister can answer one of them, and I'm reassured by the way he indicated that he likes to engage in detail. EU citizens were promised that if the UK leaves the EU without a deal, their rights will be the same as under the withdrawal agreement. So can the Minister confirm that despite previous indications to the contrary, the government will retain the right to appeal settled status decisions in the case of a no-deal Brexit?
Minister.
Well, the settled status scheme is working very well. Over 1 million people out of the 3 million have applied. Nobody has been rejected, and people have the ability to apply all the way up to the 31st of December 2020.
Newlands.
Number 11, Mr. Speaker.
The government is delivering over 300 specific no-deal projects across a range of sectors, and delivery is well advanced. There is still more work to do, and we are turbocharging our preparation under the leadership of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Gavin Newland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've heard so much nonsense this morning, in fact, over the last 3 years, that it wasn't really a surprise this morning to hear the Secretary of State talk about a depreciation of experts in the government. But last night, this House voted for legislation to block a no-deal Brexit. So does he accept the vote of this House, and will his government strictly adhere to the rule of law when this bill has royal assent?
A little dismissive of the benches opposite for the honourable gentleman to dismiss it as all as nonsense. So, I think it's the first SNP question, so saying we've already heard the nonsense seems a tad premature. The reality is the government is preparing extensively for no deal. We have a big information campaign which has launched. There's over 300 projects underway, and we are working actually constructively with the devolved administrations, including the Scottish Government.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the bill that passed this House yesterday becomes an Act of Parliament. That governs what we do in this country. But of course we cannot guarantee a no deal because the European Union might not agree to an extension. So would the Secretary of State agree or confirm that the government will continue to prepare for no deal despite any Act of Parliament here, because it's not within our control what happens?
My honourable friend is a keen observer of these matters, and he is absolutely correct. So the decision on an extension is not a... The honourable lady says what? I'm merely stating the legal position. I'm sorry that she finds the legal position somewhat distasteful, but that is the legal position. The legal position on an extension is that it requires the support of every member state, including the United Kingdom. So it is the case. The honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, is correct. She keeps chuntering. My honourable friend is correct in his question, which is we would need to continue to prepare for no deal because it is within the scope of any member of state to block an extension. That is the legal position.
Grady.
Speaker, the Scottish Parliament tonight will vote overwhelmingly, I'm sure, to oppose this government's intention to crash out with a no deal and to condemn its decision to prorogue Parliament for 5 solid weeks. It's the case that nobody in Scotland voted for no deal. Scotland voted overwhelmingly to remain in the European Union. So will the government pay attention to the views of Scotland, or does it simply not care?
Well, I think not just this government will pay attention. I'm sure the people of Scotland will pay attention to a vote against democracy. It's not the first time that the benches opposite have ignored the votes of the British people, whether it's in the referendum in 2014 that they want to overturn, or the referendum of the United Kingdom in 2016. They seem to have a problem with listening to the democratic will of the people.
Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At my discussions with ABP, who manage the Port of Immingham and the other Humber ports, there's a clear indication that they are well prepared in their contingency plans to handle any problems that may occur. Could the Secretary of State confirm that our ports are indeed well prepared for no deal, and also that they can take a much heart from the advantages such as free port status that will be available post-Brexit?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I met with the Association of British Ports and others before the reshuffle looking at these issues, and they are well advanced. He'll also know that the government's allocated additional funding for those ports, and he'll also be aware that whilst in this place a huge amount of the debate tends to focus on Dover because of the vehicle flow through Dover, in terms of the actual containers and value of goods going through, it is the other ports that are actually more significant in terms of their value.
Mr. Speaker, the Yellowhammer report that the government are determined to hide from us warns of delays of up to 2.5 days at ports, freight traffic capacity reduced by 40 to 60%, and in terms medical supplies vulnerable to severe extended delays. The government tried to pretend that was an old report, but that wasn't true. It's August 2019. They tried to pretend it was a very, very worst-case scenario. That's not true either. It's a reasonable worst-case scenario, not the most likely, but likely enough to need to be planned for. When will the government accept that all the trade organisations, all the professional bodies, all the people who understand the industry who are saying that no deal would be a disaster are right, and that this government is the ones that are wrong?
Well, there's an oddity, Mr. Speaker, within the honourable gentleman's question, because he accuses us of hiding the Yellowhammer documentation, and yet it's shared with the Scottish Government as part of our internal working to prepare for no deal. So we're not hiding these, but it is the case in government that you prepare documents prepare documents on which you then put in place funding and other measures to tackle them. And in fact, the Public Accounts Committees and others were the first to criticise if that detailed preparation was not taking place.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Is the government today giving absolutely unreserved and unrestricted permission to the governments of Scotland and Wales to publish that report in full today? Yes or no?
No, it's always the case that in government you prepare documents in order to work and ensure we have the preparation in place. The point is, what is likely What is the impact on the EU27? What is it we can put in place that addresses the concerns such as on the flow of goods? I alluded in my earlier question, for example, on the 2/3 of medicines that go to Ireland. I could have said about the 40% of Irish exports. 40% of Irish exports go through Dover. This is an issue that concerns both the Commission and the United Kingdom. That's why we're preparing these documents. We're working openly with the Scottish Government and others on that, and that is what the Government should be doing.
Finally, Mr Alan Brown.
Question 14, Mr Speaker.
Mr Doddridge.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I spoke with the Home Secretary this week on the issues of the EU settlement scheme. The scheme is operating well. 1 million people have passed through that scheme out of the 3 million. There have been no rejected applications, and the Prime Minister made a very big, bold offer to EU citizens who remain our friends, our neighbours, and they're welcome here in the United Kingdom.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Minister says the system's working well. I can tell him the reality is it is not. My wife Cindy is an EU citizen, and due to the government rhetoric, she reluctantly decided to apply for settled status. I can tell the Government Minister the system crashed, and officials operating it said that they couldn't handle the volume of traffic. Is it because of this process is a shambles that the Government's had to do a U-turn in the 31st October threat of ending freedom of movement, or is it the threat of court actions that's caused the U-turn?
Minister.
We have improved the system on an ongoing basis and are keen to do so. And the default position is that we want people to get that settled status. The honourable gentleman makes some specific points around a specific case, and I'm sure the Home Office would be happy to look at that and understand how they can improve the system further.
Order. Topical questions. Louise Haigh.
Topical number 1, Mr Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, since I last updated the House, I have pleasure in welcoming my honourable friend, the member for Watford and Southend, to his ministerial place, and an opportunity to thank my honourable friends, the member for Spelthorne and Braintree, who now both join me in the Cabinet. We have a new Prime Minister who is committed to leaving on the 31st of October, and within the ministerial portfolios, I welcome my right honourable friend, the Chancellor Duchy of Lancaster, who has taken on responsibility for domestic operational planning in the context of no deal. This, Mr Speaker, enables me and my department to focus on negotiations with the EU, in which we will seek to achieve a best-in-class free trade agreement. Throughout the summer, I have visited a number of European capitals and had regular conversations with my key interlocutors, including the Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland and the French Europe Minister, with whom I had recent productive meetings in Paris.
Mr Speaker, if I was still a serving police officer and I had arrested a European national who, unbeknownst to me, was wanted for a string of serious violent sexual offences, at the moment I would simply have to access a database on booking him into custody in order to find that out. Could the Secretary of State spell out in detail how I or my custody sergeant would do that if we leave without a deal on the 1st of November?
So, well, under the current position, it would depend which member state it pertained to, because we've already got in place a bilateral arrangement with Ireland to reflect the common travel area, so it would depend within the member states, because the arrangements currently are in place, vary between those member states. But she's right in the premise of her question, which is we stand willing, because the UK puts more data on the European arrest warrant than any other member state. We think that the UK contribution is of value to the European Union, and that it's not in their interest to put their citizens at risk by not reciprocating that. So we stand ready to work with them. It is the Commission and my counterpart Misha Barnier who has ruled out what he calls mini deals to address the concern that she raises.
Rudy Harrison.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can my right honourable friend confirm that when we leave the EU, with or without a deal, the provision of medicines will remain uninterrupted into the UK?
As we covered earlier in the question session, a huge amount of work has been done by the Department of Health and Social Care, including additional procurement capacity, including their express delivery, and that builds on extensive work by the industry, both in terms of additional stock and in terms of the additional flow capacity they themselves have procured.
Mr. Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I want to ask specifically about the important issue of Northern Ireland. Can the Secretary of State confirm that the Government remains fully committed to all the existing elements of the December 2017 joint report between the UK and the EU negotiators? Yes or no?
So our commitments have been set out in the letter to President Tusk, and what that says within that is our commitment to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which includes putting no infrastructure at the border to impede north-south flow.
Mr. Speaker, I asked a careful question. I got a careful answer, and it wasn't to confirm full commitment. So let me press on, because it's been reported this week that the EU member states were told by the Commission that the UK government was proposing to reduce the ambitions of the 2017 joint report relating to Northern Ireland. So not the Good Friday Agreement, the 2017 joint report. In particular, it's reported that the UK is rowing back from the legally operable solutions, the words in the report, to avoiding a hard border, to what has been described as aspirational measures, quite specific. And a pledge only now to have trade across the Irish border that is as frictionless as possible. Again, a difference. These are very important issues, and I know there's been a bit of knockabout this morning, but this is of huge importance across Ireland. Can the Secretary of State take this opportunity to reject these reports and make clear that there will be no rowing back from the solemn commitments made 2 years ago in that 2017 joint report?
Secretary of State.
Well, as I said in my previous answer, first, there's no rowing back from the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. That's an area of common accord between us. Secondly, the reason I pointed towards the North-South cooperation is he will be well aware that in the letter to President Tusk, the Prime Minister drew a distinction between the backstop and the Northern Ireland Protocol, and he will know that whilst in this chamber they're often used interchangeably, there is a distinction between those two things, particularly on the basis that the North-South cooperation, the common travel area and the benefits of the single electricity market are distinct from the points in terms of alignment. So there is a distinction drawn there. In terms of his further question around legally operative text, to some extent, I addressed this point in part in my remarks in the chamber yesterday, in that there is a distinction between the Commission saying that all aspects need to be set out in legally operative text by the 31st of October, and looking at, for example, what role the Joint Commission has during the implementation period, because the implementation period often means that things need to be in place by the end of December 2020, or if extended for 1 or 2 further years by mutual agreement. So it is within that that there is a distinction to be drawn.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Secretary of State think there should be a general election before the next European Council so the British people can decide whether they want the leader of the opposition as Prime Minister and keep us in the European Union, or whether the British people want to return our excellent current Prime Minister and take us out by the 31st of October?
Secretary of State.
Well, Mr. Speaker, yes, we need to know at the 17th of October Council who can negotiate on the British people, and in particular who can deliver on the express will that's set out in the referendum. And what we have from the benches opposite is a doublespeak that will leave us in legislative purgatory, because they're saying on the one hand that they will vote against every deal that is put forward. 3 times they voted against the deal. Their own deal was rejected by the House as well. And yet they also vote against no deal. Well, the inevitable consequence of that is that they're not prepared to leave, even though their own manifesto said they will. And the real question for the British public at the next election will be, how can you trust what Labour say in their manifesto on Brexit when they have gone back on every word of what they said at the last general election?
Say something about that. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from my honourable friend, we are now halfway through the time period set by the German Chancellor to produce the alternatives to the backstop. In the light that governments have decided to prorogue Parliament from perhaps next Monday, will the Secretary of State ensure that their proposals come to this House so that they can be scrutinised by this House, and including the Select Committee for leaving the European Union?
I think the chair of the Select Committee will concede that I have probably been the most frequent of the holders, I know there's been more than one, holders of this role in terms of the regularity of my appearances before his committee and others. In terms of the well, actually, not compared to the first one, actually, but compared to the second, the Foreign Secretary. In terms of the substance of the question, a huge amount of work has gone on. For example, it goes to the member for Ludlow's question. I think of the alternative working groups. I chair the technical working group. My honourable friend, the member for Rochford and South East, chairs the business group. He was in Northern Ireland with that group over the summer. And I think it goes again to the question to the member for Ludlow. Work has been going on throughout the summer on alternative arrangements. But if it's simply published against an all-weather, all-insurance test, it will be dismissed, as it was under the last government, as magical thinking. That's what the last government experienced. So we need to get into that detail. That work is going on, but it needs to be discussed in the appropriate way.
Stephen Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could my right honourable friend confirm whether or not, since July the 25th, the Department has had any discussions with the financial sector about the implications of any revised policy, which would be a policy of regulatory divergence?
He raises a specific issue, and as a former Economic Secretary to the Treasury, and knowing that the markets take a keen interest in these sort of discussions, if I may, I'll ask the Chancellor or the Economic Secretary to come back to him on this specific issue that he raises.
Dr. Rosanna Allen Carr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thousands of Tooting residents have signed my local petition against this government's dangerous Brexit plans. Like me, Tooting wants to remain. The Brexit Secretary voted against legislation to block a disastrous no deal. Tooting are absolutely furious. Why is he trying to drive this country blindly off the Brexit cliff?
Secretary of State.
I think the Honourable Lady would agree with me that there's more than one voice in Tooting, and I'm sure there will be a range of voices, as indeed there are, but I don't reconcile from the fact that I'm sure she speaks for a majority in her constituency in making that point. The point that I think is behind my approach is when this Parliament says that it will give the British people the say, when the government of the day writes to the British people and says it will honour the result. When this House then votes to trigger Article 50 by a significant margin to deliver on that result, it undermines our democracy. If we then have members of this House on the one hand voting against a deal, and then the other hand saying that we'll countenance no deal. I think that's a threat to our democracy, and I think it's a threat to our international reputation as a country that defends democracy around the world.
Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to protect farmers and manufacturers in the hopefully unlikely event of a no-deal Brexit?
I thank the honourable gentleman for that question. It is a very important question. DEFRA have confirmed that they will support the same farmers in the same cash terms as they've been supported under the current scheme, and we're looking with farmers to look at new markets across government, working with them on business. We continue to work with businesses both large and small, and would particularly encourage small businesses to engage with the government in their preparation in the eventuality of no deal.
Martin Doherty Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I congratulate the Secretary of State on his grand tour of Europe in the recent weeks during the recess, notably to Finland, a nation of 5 million people, an enthusiastic member of the European Union. Can I ask him specifically, given that the UK was actually only the 7th largest importer to Finland in 2018, how will leave the single market and the customs union improve on that dismal position?
Well, first, on the one hand, colleague's question whether we're engaging, and then, on the other hand, the honourable gentleman sort of appears to suggest that we're engaging too much, and therefore he needs to make his mind up. In terms of how we promote further trade, firstly, there are opportunities beyond Europe that we're keen to seize, and the Secretary of State for International Trade. On the issue that he chances on Finland, well, actually, Mr. Speaker, I chaired a breakfast meeting with business leaders when I was in Helsinki, including looking, for example, at the links on key areas like timber, where there is an appetite to further strengthen bilateral trade. And there was a huge appetite within the business leaders I spoke to there to do more trade with the United Kingdom, including with Scotland as part of that United Kingdom.
Order. Urgent question, Mr. David Liddington.
Because, with permission, I should like to ask the Secretary of State for Transport if he will make a statement on the Government's review of HS2.
The Secretary of State for Transport, Secretary Grant Shapps.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my first time at the dispatch box as the new Secretary of State for Transport, and I welcome the opportunity to update the House on HS2. I don't think there's any future in obscuring the cost, benefits or timetable of HS2, so I've announced on the 21st of August an independent cross-party review led by Douglas Oakervie into whether and how HS2 should or shouldn't proceed. The review will consider its affordability, its deliverability, benefits, scope, phasing, including its relationship with Northern Powerhouse Rail. The chair will be supported by a deputy chair, Lord Berkeley, and a panel of experts from business, academia and transport to ensure it's independent, thorough and objective in its assessment programme. Some of these individuals on the panels have been very passionate advocates, others have been extremely vocal critics of this project, but these panellists will provide input to and be consulted on the report's conclusions. This review is actually underway and it will report to me on time this autumn. I'll discuss its findings with the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, and its recommendations will help inform our decisions on the next step or otherwise for this project. On our first day back on the 3rd of September, colleagues will be aware that I placed in the House, or if they're not, it's there, advice that I received over the summer from the recently appointed chairman of HS2 Limited, Alan Cook, on the cost and deliverability of the current scheme. The chairman of HS2 has said that he does not believe the current scheme can be delivered within the budget of £55.7 billion set in 2015 prices. Instead, he estimates that the current scheme requires a total budget, including contingency, in the range of 72 to 78 billion, again set in 2015 prices. And regarding schedule, the chairman does not believe the current schedule of 2026 will be delivered for its initial services of phase 1. He doesn't think that's realistic. In line with lessons from other large major transport infrastructure projects, his advice proposes a range of start dates rather than a specific one. He recommends 2028 to 2031 for phase 1, with the staged opening starting with initial services between London Old Oak Common, Birmingham Curzon Street, followed by services to and from London Euston later. He expects phase 2B, the full high-speed line to Manchester and Leeds, to be open between 2035 and 2040. The chairman is also of the view that the benefits of the current scheme are also substantially undervalued. All these matters will now be considered by Douglas Oakervie within the scope of the Oakervie review itself. I said when I announced the independent review into HS2 that I now want Doug Oakervie and his panel to assess independently these findings and other available existing evidence. That review will provide recommendations on whether and how we proceed. Stepping back, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to make one further wider point. We all in this House know we must invest in modern infrastructure to ensure the future prosperity of our nation. However, it is right that we subject every single project to the most rigorous scrutiny possible. And if we are to truly maximise every opportunity, this must always be done with an open mind and a clean sheet of paper.
Mr David Lidington.
Mr Speaker, can I first of all congratulate my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, on his new responsibilities and welcome the review that the government has set up. I have three questions for my right honourable friend. First, in view of this week's revelation that HS2 is overrunning both its budget and its schedule, something which many of us have been predicting for a long time but which has been systematically denied for years by HS2 Limited and by his department, what assurance can my right honourable friend give to the House about the transparency of both the review that has been commissioned and the government's formal response to that? Second, my right honourable friend will know that enabling works for HS2 are still being carried out along phase 1 of the route. Ancient woodlands are being felled, productive farmland is being occupied and used by HS2 Limited. Public money is being spent on these works, while the review, as my right honourable friend says, may lead to a recommendation to cancel or significantly change the project altogether. So will the Secretary of State now accept that those works are prejudicial to the outcome of the review that he has established and order that they cease? Third, I have a queue of constituents whose land has been taken by HS2 Limited for preparatory works, but who have still to receive the payments that were formally agreed with HS2 Limited. Now, the government is rightly committed to crack down on late payment. Would my right honourable friend not agree that HS2 Limited should be setting an example in this regard, acting as a laggard? And since he, as Secretary of State, is the sole shareholder in HS2 Limited, will he now take responsibility for insisting that HS2 Limited puts this injustice right immediately?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, look, first of all, on budget and schedule, exactly as I said in my opening statement, I'd say to my right honourable friend, I completely agree. There is just no future in trying to obscure costs or being unclear about it. It is the case that in a massive infrastructure project, Europe's biggest, in a developing project, costs just aren't known, they're speculated about, you then start to firm them up as you literally dig into the ground in this case. So I can see how over a period of time things move, but nonetheless, I simply take the view, as soon as I've got the information, I will inform the House. As soon as I got that Cook report and the House returned, I stuck it straight into the library. I can assure my right honourable friend I will continue to do exactly that going forward. Secondly, I think it might be helpful to colleagues to know that I've asked for Douglas Oakerby to meet with members of Parliament. He has set up in committee room on Monday 2A on Monday the 9th between 3:30 and 5 an opportunity for any colleagues to go and see him, and you can make your own arrangements with him separately, but I'll inform the House of that. On the enabling works, look, we're in a position where I'll have to make a go, no-go decision about this in December. And I know that this won't delight my right honourable friend, but it seemed to me that even to be in that position, if we didn't continue to make preparatory works, then I wouldn't be in a go, no-go decision. I'm sorry to disappoint him, but that is the current position, and then we can take a decision. On CPO payments, I share his concern and anxiety. When people are having their lives, their livelihoods, their homes potentially ripped apart by a project, supposedly for the wider good, it is right that the state compensates them promptly and efficiently. I would be most grateful to see more details of those cases. I've already had one across my desk, which I've sorted out, and I'd like to see others. There's no excuse for a CPO where people aren't paid for it.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too congratulate the Secretary of State on his appointment and welcome him to his place. And he comes into post at a time of crisis for the country, but an absolutely critical moment for HS2. I would just gently remind him that we did ask for regular reports and we recommended a peer review when Phase 2A was before this House some weeks ago, and I'm sorry that he wasn't able to vote for that, or indeed for the Prime Minister to express a view at all. He's also mentioned that this is a cross-party review underway. I just gently point out that there's been no consultation with me whatsoever, and if it's to be genuinely cross-party, perhaps he might want to take up that invitation. But we've been consistently told by his predecessors and his then ministerial team that the 2015 figure of £55.7 billion for the entire project was the full cost of HS2 and that there was no reason to change it. Mr Speaker, it's hard to conclude anything other that it has been plain and obvious for some considerable time that this was not accurate. So I asked the Transport Secretary, when was his predecessor told that the figure of 55 timetable for delivery could not be adhered to? Mr Speaker, isn't this yet more evidence that this government has totally failed to exercise any control over this project, not just in terms of cost, but in terms of that Parliament may have been misled, however unwittingly, given that it's stark staringly obvious that when the Minister responsible for HS2 stood at that dispatch box a matter of weeks ago to tell the House that there was only one figure for HS2 and one figure alone, that assertion was completely and totally inaccurate. If there is going to be delay, can the Secretary of State give some assurance to the 9,000 people who are currently employed by HS2, what assurances can be given to them? Mr Speaker, this government continues to be characterised by lack of transparency, and I welcome the remarks of the Secretary of State to put that right, but that still remains, and that lack of candour. And Mr Speaker, once we can be assured that there is no prospect of them reneging on the legislation to avoid a no-deal Brexit, we on this side of the House relish the prospect of a general election to turf them out.
Secretary of State. Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Look, on regular reports, I will come back to this House as many times as the House is prepared to hear about it and continue to update in every possible way possible. I thought it might be helpful if I also were to make the introduction, if the Honourable Gentleman hasn't already, had it to Doug Oakervie and perhaps organise for him to meet separately with him. There are, of course, cross-party members on the review, and the review is genuinely kind of full of sceptics. I think people were surprised when we launched a review which had such a broad cross view on this project. Look, in terms of prices, I mean, he's absolutely right, the prices have changed over time. I seem to recall that this was originally a project by the previous Labour government. It was going to cost about £13 billion for the whole thing when it was first conceived. One of the issues that we have, and I think it's a wider issue than HS2, is that these things start off being fixed in a price of a particular period of time. This £55.7 billion was about 2015 prices, and it doesn't actually allow for inflation. And so you end up quoting prices which are just out of date, and every project on that basis will always be said to have overrun on costs, because probably actually the benefits also improve as well. So I think we have to find better ways of doing all of this. I can reassure the Honourable Gentleman, the first that I received advice on this was Alan Cook's final report on the 1st of August, and that's the report that I published. And finally, I can undertake that we will make sure that we return to this House with every piece of update that we have, and I encourage him to be involved in the Oakervie review.
Colleagues will be aware that there is some pressure on time today because there are several further pieces of business to follow, but equally understandably there is intense interest in this monumental mess, and I know that the Secretary of State is very keen, to his credit, to answer questions on the matter, so I shall do my best as always to accommodate the understandable interest of colleagues. Dame Cheryl Gillan.
Mr Speaker, I was just about to say there are still people affected, members affected by this project that don't have a voice. I was going to include yourself. Clearly that is not the case. And of course the Right Honourable Member for South Northamptonshire, who has always joined me in the fight against HS2. And in welcoming the Secretary of State to his position, can I also welcome my Right Honourable friend from my neighbouring friend in Aylesbury? It's so good to hear his voice raised in this chamber against this dreadful project. I endorse everything that the member for Aylesbury has said, and it applies to my constituency as well. Can I say to the Secretary of State that he also needs to look at the National Rail Travel Survey, on which one of the raison d'etres for this project is based. It has not been updated since 2010. In answers to me, the Department doesn't appear to know how much it would cost to update it. But that, coupled with the fact that we are not allowed still to see the passenger forecasting documentation, means that transparency is far from being the watchword of HS2. Can I just say to him that, having looked at the chairman's stock tape, to find pages, Mr. Speaker, that have absolutely redacted right the way through means that transparency is not the order of the day. Can I just say that this opportunity to review entirely this project should be grasped with both hands by the Secretary of State, and he should actually review the nationwide transport and communication policy. And I urge him to take a deep breath and look at a comprehensive assessment across car, bus, train, air, and indeed the new technologies such as 5G and broadband, because I think it's essential that we look at the technological advances before we let this project go any further. Can I just say, Mr. Speaker, that as the carriages being built for Crossrail pile up in Worksop because we can't get that project right, let us just draw a deep breath, cancel this project, start again, and get a decent, comprehensive transport policy.
Secretary of State.
I know that Douglas Oakerby will have been listening to my right honourable friend's words with great interest and will no doubt take into account the latest National Rail Travel Survey information. She will, of course, meet with him as well. And I'll just reflect on the final point, because the rest of it is, of course, Douglas Oakerby is looking at all this. The final point about all forms of travel and across the country. I entirely agree with my right honourable friend. I recently, having ordered it 2 years ago, got an electric car, and it arrived finally a couple of weeks ago. It is clear that transport is changing in this country. It is absolutely clear that we have to take a more holistic view of transport at all, of which rail is one part, and there's much else to consider.
Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to welcome the Secretary of State to his new position, and he must be so thankful to have inherited another failing Grayling legacy. Mr. Speaker, we know the increased costs and delays have been covered up since 2016 and denied at the dispatch box, so while I welcome the review, should there not be an inquiry into this hiding of key information from the House? And while I welcome the review, it's a bit strange that we've got a document that sets out the terms of the review and around a third of this document is redacted. So can the Secretary explain why that is? What changes are going to be made to the cost-benefit criteria going forward and why? And while the Secretary said many of the benefits of the scheme were previously underestimated, I would remind him a lot of the business case rested in the fact there's assumptions that any business people travelling the train were treated as downtime, so shorter journeys was treated as extra productive time. But clearly that's not the same now. We've got Wi-Fi on the go, so we confirm that the business case won't be over-egged in that aspect. Now, the current proposals also mean that journeys north of Crewe to Scotland will actually be slower than the existing Virgin service just now. So will the review look at that and look at perhaps a different type of rolling stock? But if it does, what does that mean for the existing rolling stock procurement, which is ongoing at the moment? What further reviews are going to be made to track design that could mean slower high-speed trains but reduced costs in terms of that cost-benefit analysis? And what is the contractual status of the recent contract awards to First Train Italia, given that the government might now be doing a full-stop decision? What would that mean for that contract? What's the spend to date, the committed spend going forward, and the Barnett allocations to Scotland? And what's going to happen going forward? We were promised at the dispatch box in day one of the high-speed trains operating they would go all the way to Scotland, and that's now not the case. So can the Secretary answer these, and if not, put them in writing, please?
I think I hope the honourable gentleman will forgive me if I write back to him on some of that rather than detain the House on all of it. But he is absolutely right, and I should have mentioned in response to my right honourable friend, I'm unhappy about having any of that Alan Cook report redacted. I've read the rest of it. It's not hugely exciting. I pushed back on that with the department, and it is just the lawyers saying this stuff is the commercially confidential stuff that I can't force to be released. But I totally agree with him. It'd be much better if you could read read every single page. I mean, that is the law. On the downtime, I don't disagree. It's just that, you know, lawyers will not allow that to happen. On the downtime when travelling, he's absolutely right. You know, lots of people work very productively when travelling. I know that's my favourite time to work uninterrupted. The benefits, I think, and that is something I can assure the honourable gentleman that Doug Oakerby will look at, the benefits to which Alan Cook was referring to were some of the build benefits where a line runs and you might therefore have new industry and so on and so forth around it, homes, etc. And the last point I'll comment on, and I'll write back to him on the rest, is implications on the West Coast Partnership, very important indeed. In their contract, I think in 2026, but it would be in line with if HS2 went ahead, they would become a shadow operator. So it's built into that particular contract if the thing goes ahead.
Order. There is a further urgent question after this, and there are then 3 ministerial statements before we get to backbench business. Therefore, there is a premium upon brevity from back and front benches alike. For the avoidance of doubt, what I'm looking for from colleagues is not dilation and not preamble, but single-sentence questions, which will be brilliantly exemplified, I feel sure, by the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Derbyshire Dale, Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
Thank you for that challenge, Mr. Speaker. Can I first welcome my Right Honourable friend to his position? Can I say to my Right Honourable friend that the easiest thing for the government to do is to cancel this project? That would be easy to do. I actually think it would be the wrong thing to do for this reason. I will find it ironical that as we leave the European Union, I can get a high-speed train to Paris or to Brussels, but not to Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield. And when my honourable friend talks about the overspend, we seem to be able to accommodate the overspend at the drop of a hat for Crossrail, which is overrunning and is a London project, as is incredibly important for London, and not take a similar view to a project which has been long thought out and, I believe, absolutely essential for the major cities outside London in this country.
Well, I would say to my right honourable friend, I'm not short of advice on what to do on HS2, but few pieces of advice come from somebody as distinguished as a former Transport Secretary. I've heard what he's had to say. I know Doug Oakerby will have done, and I look forward to taking it into account.
Lillian Greenwood.
I welcome the Secretary of State to his place. He must understand the huge disappointment in the East Midlands that HS2 Phase 2B, which will transform connectivity, as the Honourable Gentleman has just said, Right Honourable Gentleman, apologies, between Birmingham and the economies of the Midlands, Yorkshire, the North East and Scotland. It's now facing a delay of up to 7 years or even cancellation. And that's particularly the case when the Chancellor yesterday failed to even mention the Midlands Rail Hub in his spending review, and when his predecessor not only repeatedly assured us that HS2 would happen, but also cancelled the electrification of the Midland Main Line. I know that the Oakerby review is due to report, but that disappointment will turn to deep anger if he doesn't ensure that the Midlands receives the investment in its transport that it needs.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have the question from the Transport Select Committee Chair. The one thing I can assure her is there's £48 billion of other unrelated rail investment over the next few years. So both the Midlands and the Northern Powerhouse Rail side of things will certainly have huge and massive investment.
Reiterating my plea for brevity, I hopefully call Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, welcome to your the Secretary of State to his new position. Second thing is, I entirely endorse the views of the member for Aylesbury and the member for Amersham. The reality is that this whole project is completely out of control. The costs have gone up, as I've said repeatedly. I've voted against it. There is a petition in the House of Lords, which I believe my constituents are absolutely right to pursue. This whole project is a complete white elephant and should be cancelled.
As I say, I'm not short of advice on this, and Doug Oakerby will definitely have heard his words.
Mr. Barry Shearman.
I'll try to be brief.
I've always been against this. I've been reviled by ministers when I've said it's going to end up at 100 billion. I wanted the investment in a network across the north of England in preference to this. But will you assure me we'll learn the lessons? This is a great sector. We do wonderful things. We built the Olympics on time and it was magnificent. We learn the lessons. I understand there are 12 gagging orders from senior former employees of HS2. Will they air their evidence? Can they give evidence to this inquiry? And can we make sure that we learn the lessons? This sector, we're good at it. Why has this gone wrong?
Well, I mean, even with the Olympics, the cost changed over a period of time is actually the truth, of course. But the honourable gentleman will know that big projects do require management, and this process is designed to make sure this is properly grasped. I agree with him. We need to deliver that transport infrastructure across the north. I'm surprised no honourable member has mentioned it yet, but these two questions are not entirely unrelated to each other, so we must get it right for the north, for all of our country.
Jeremy Wright. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure it's the entirely appropriate expression to congratulate my right honourable friend for inheriting responsibility for HS2, but may I wholeheartedly congratulate him for becoming the Secretary of State. In agreeing entirely with what our right honourable friend for Aylesbury has put to him this morning, can I press the Secretary of State on the point he made about enabling works? As he knows, there is more than one kind of enabling work currently underway. Some of the enabling work is the destruction of ancient woodland sites. There are 7 of them in my constituency, along with a very old and much valued pear tree in the village of Cubbington. Surely it is possible and surely it is sensible, given that he's announced an all-options review, including the possibility that this project will be cancelled or significantly revised, surely it's possible and sensible to categorise those types of enabling work that will do irreversible damage and postpone them until the review has concluded. He's already announced a substantial delay in this project. Surely a delay of a few weeks more would be sensible to make sure we don't do irreversible damage.
Mr. Speaker, as I said before, to have a proper go, no-go decision, we do need to continue to allow enabling works. However, I can actually ask my right honourable friend and the Transport Minister, who is handling these major projects, to meet and discuss this specific concern.
Dennis Skinner.
Unlike Derbyshire Dales, the HS2 goes through many villages in the Bolsover and North East Derbyshire area. The result is that there are a lot of people in those villages, more than 100 people affected by the HS2. I want to know as soon as possible just exactly what is going to happen to this £100 billion project, because it goes through Derbyshire on 2 separate lines. Not only does it go past Sheffield, it also stops at the Sheffield station. And so there is a slow track and a fast track in Derbyshire. The idea that the HS2 is based upon getting to London 30 minutes sooner is a joke. And for that reason, he should start over again.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Look, I know that the honourable gentleman's constituency is affected in a big way, and I refer to what I said before. This project affects a lot of people's lives, and demolitions and the rest of it in his patch. He asked me to do this as soon as possible. I have got Douglas Oakerby on an unbelievable timetable, supported by a fantastic group of people, to get this done and reported back this autumn. He will not have to wait before the end of the year.
Maggie Throop.
Speaker, Long Eaton and Sandy Acre and Stanton Gate are grossly affected by the eastern arm of HS2. And as the Chair of the Treasury Select Committee has already indicated, it brings its advantage as well. It brings jobs and growth as well as the pain. 2 things. One is that any delay causes further stress and uncertainty, not just for residents, but for businesses as well. And they will be blighted forevermore, even if my honourable friend takes the easy way out and cancels the Eastern Arm. And my plea to the Secretary of State is do not cancel that Eastern Arm. I will not allow the East Midlands and Erewash to be the poor relations yet again.
Mr. Speaker, I think every exchange indicates the extent to which, whilst everyone is able to welcome a review, I suspect when we get to the announcement of that review and the other side, that the House won't be quite so united. But I absolutely hear my honourable friend's comments.
Liam Byrne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Inflation aside, this multi-billion-pound increase in costs betrays nothing other than sheer incompetence in the management of this project. But in the West Midlands, 100,000 jobs are now in jeopardy. Hundreds of millions of pounds of new rates are now in jeopardy. The future prospects of the younger generation are now in jeopardy. So I want to know from the Secretary of State what compensation has been sought by the Mayor of the West Midlands, because my understanding is he's asked for precisely nothing.
Well, we have on the Doug Oakervey board a range of different people, including Andy Street. We are making sure that all the representations therefore go into it. And as I say, I don't want to kind of rush to prejudge this. We do know certain things. We know from the Alan Cook report this range of 72 to 78 billion. I don't have confidence in the data that I've been provided yet to know whether the benefits have outstripped or understripped these various different costs. And I just start with a blank sheet of paper, and I just want the data. Give me the facts, and then we'll be in a much better position to decide, including for people throughout the West Midlands.
Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm sure I was as pleased as you were, Mr. Speaker, to hear about the review undertaken by the new Secretary of State. Can he reassure me that as part of the new cost-benefit analysis, the review will take into account that many people work very hard while on trains, as I am about to do as I return to my constituency on a high-speed train run by Chiltern Rail?
Well, absolutely. I think sort of travelling on a train can be a fantastic way to chomp through constituency work or anything else that people are doing on business or on pleasure. And I think it is one of the most civilised ways to work when we have our trains running on time, which is another related priority.
Yeah, I've just got...
Yvette Cooper.
I've got somebody...
Will the government widen this review, not just into its complete lack of grip on the HS2 project, but into the continued failure of the department to remember that there are towns as well as cities in this country continually locking billions of pounds into ever-delayed, ever-escalating projects for cities, whilst towns like ours in Castleford and Pontefract have inadequate trains, overcrowded, the old Pacer trains, no disabled access to our trains, and once again we're just expected to accept a trickle-down benefits many decades into the future. It's not good enough. When will we actually get a fair deal for our towns?
Well, as the representative of two towns, one which calls itself a city but it's actually a town in Welwyn Garden, I absolutely agree with the idea that towns have a very significant part to play in the economic and social life of our country. One good piece of news, those Pacers are finally going by the end of this year.
Julian Lewis.
What level of exorbitant expenditure will the government finally decide to pull the plug?
So it's not just a question of the expenditure, as I mentioned before, it's also what the benefits are. So can I ask my honourable friend to just be patient enough so that the data is gathered on both sides of that and we can come to a rational and sensible decision.
Now follow the right honourable gentleman for New Forest East with single-sentence questions. If they don't, let's be absolutely clear, they're stopping other colleagues taking part. It's as simple as that. Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister commit to look at any new major transport infrastructure projects in line with the 2050 net zero carbon target that this House has set itself?
Yes.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a north-south divide when it comes to transport spending. Can the Secretary of State give an assurance that he will consider the benefits to the northern economy when he reaches his decision?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask what the status of this review is if we go to the polls this autumn? My constituents see it as a pre-election bribe for their voters in the Shires.
Well, look, I think this project's too serious to be thinking in those terms, and I certainly wasn't thinking in those terms when I asked Douglas Oakervee to do the review. As I've said twice now, this is about people's lives, their livelihoods, and the ability of the economy of the country to function. So we should, and I hope we do, regardless of what happens when we finally get that election call, I hope there will be a cross-party consensus to continue this important work on a cross-party basis and get this job done.
Will the Secretary of State look at the cost envelope by taking into account enhancements that benefit those on the route, inflation and incompetence?
Well, as the terms of reference, which I encourage honourable and right honourable members to read, makes clear, this is wide-ranging and does take all of the matters into account.
Right, Betts.
Given the delays to the southern section of the route, will the Secretary of State now ask the review to look at the possibility of starting the northern sections before the southern sections finish, so there's a degree of working overlap?
That is, in fact, one of the things that Douglas Oakervee is looking at. And interestingly, in Alan Cook's report, which is in the library, he suggests doing 2A and 1 together.
Craig Whittaker.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend that spiralling costs need to be challenged and indeed held to account. However, this is vital for the northern routes which are already overstretched. Can my right honourable friend assure me that this actually isn't just a smokescreen to cancel this project, which many of our current executive don't like?
My honourable friend's question reminds me of after I did a clip on the day of announcing this, that we're going to have a full, thorough and open review, that when the camera was switched off, they said, but what do you really think? What I really think is let's have a full, open and thorough review.
Failed. One sentence.
Business leaders in Sheffield are deeply concerned about this review. Does the Secretary of State recognise, in whatever else he's considering, cancellation would damage the northern economy?
Well, I can assure the honourable gentleman, whatever happens, the northern economy and northern powerhouse rail is set to steam ahead.
Jeremy Lefroy.
Will the review take into account the potentially negative effects of the business case on the existing and absolutely vital West Coast Main Line?
Yes, it will, but can I... Well, I mean, I would ask my honourable friend to actually meet with Douglas Oakervee to make those points, because, yes, every element of this is being taken into account.
John Cryer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't it the case that there are many abandoned former railway lines across the country for which there is now extensive demand, for the first time for a very long time, which could be reopened for a fraction of the cost of HS2?
With huge respect to him, I curse beaching every day in this job. Yes, I agree with him entirely.
Ozzy.
Delay of the effective delay or cancellation on the West Coast Main Line, which is of concern to my constituents in Rugby.
I don't think there's any direct ramification, and we've just re-let the West Coast Partnership contract, so none, I think, is the answer.
Smith.
Mr. Speaker, HS2 is vital for the economy of Manchester and the North because, as the Chairman's stocktake says, it's not a standalone railway, it's an integral part of ambitious regional growth plans that are already attracting investment. So can the Secretary of State assure us that those wider benefits will be taken fully into account in this review?
I can, and I've met with the Manchester Mayor and mayors across the north, and will absolutely be taking that into account. I'm due to meet with them again shortly.
I voted against HS2 every time. Wouldn't the money be better spent on our improvements to our existing conventional rail network?
The answer is I don't know. I'd like to think that 48 billion on improving and upgrading our existing networks a very good down payment, though.
Ronnie Cowan.
Parliament under Secretary of State for Transport assured me the full stretch of HS2 will go up to Scotland. Is that the case, and when?
As the honourable gentleman will know, we're currently struggling with stage 1, 2A and 2B, but as he knows, the overall plan was always to go further.
Patterson.
Thanks. Will the Secretary of State commit to investigating the cost of those with collateral damage, such as villages like mine in war, which will suffer grievously during the construction process? And will he also commit to looking at the value of spending £100 billion, to which this project is cantering towards, on full fibre broadband to every household?
But look, I think, again, we need to have full fibre broadband, and that's a commitment of this government to every household regardless. But returning to the, as he describes, devastation to his villagers, Look, I absolutely agree. People's lives, we have to find a better way of doing this and look after people properly when great national projects drive through their homes.
Significant UK and Welsh Government money is going into growth deals in North Wales linked to HS2 at Crewe. What opportunities are there for the Welsh Government to formally feed into the review?
Enormous opportunities. If not on Monday, at that time that I mentioned at the dispatch box earlier, then separately I'd be very happy to hook the Honourable Gentleman and any of his colleagues up with Doug Oakerby on this.
Mr. Speaker, HS2 will be the most expensive railway ever built by mankind. Would he agree that there is a very significant opportunity cost, and therefore, to get bang for our buck, we should be investing in significant regional infrastructure projects?
Well, it's very effective lobbying, but I know that my honourable friend has already made a great achievement at the railway on his own island, so he proves that we can do both things simultaneously if we need to.
Rail investment in the north has to be a high-speed link between Liverpool in the west and Hull in the east. And isn't it right that any additional resources should be put into that rather than HS2?
Well, I'd extend that further. Sheffield, Hull, Newcastle and other cities in the north. We can do both these things, and we will do both these things in terms of both upgrading the national rail structure, but in particular, and it was the first speech of the Prime Minister in Manchester, I think it would be a bit churlish not to recognise it, which talked about linking the northern cities.
David Drew. Speaker, the problem with HS2 is that the benefits are not shared around the country. The West in particular gains nothing. Will he look at how we could put the money into electrification and indeed rebuilding the Severn Tunnel?
Look, I don't know what form this will or won't take place in, but I do know that the jobs and skill and supply chain actually affects the entire nation. There's almost not a constituency in the country that wouldn't benefit in some way. As with any big national infrastructure project, we need to make sure that the benefits of that work and supply chain are spread across the nation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that the entire review will be completed in a matter of weeks, can the Minister really have confidence that it will have thoroughly considered the impact scrapping or changing phases 2A and 2B would have on Crewe and Nantwich as a significant centre of economic activity for the wider region?
Yes, I think I can reassure the Honourable Member that although this is reporting very quickly, within weeks, as she said, the experience on that panel adds up to years. I haven't added up, possibly hundreds of years of rail experience. So I think they will really take that into account. Again, I would invite and welcome her to speak to Douglas Oakerby to make sure 2A and 2B are fully represented in her terms.
Can the Minister give us a date when we can expect HS2 to be extended to Scotland? And if not, are the people of Scotland expected to sit and watch $100 billion being spent on this project when it literally pulls up short?
Well, I don't want to disappoint the Honourable Lady. I can't give her a date. I can't give her a date on the initial phases, let alone that extension. But look, I do think there's a very good nation point here, isn't there, about linking up our union, and I'm pleased to see the nationalist side so on side with that project.
The Minister mentions the extension to Scotland. However, actually, journey times between Glasgow and Manchester will increase as a result of HS2. So will the Minister ask the review to consider expediting an extension north to Glasgow from Manchester as a matter of urgency?
Well, again, I think this comes into the wider picture. 48 billion of rail investment over 5 years means that we should be able to do lots of different things at the same time, and indeed are. So I think that is part of the wider infrastructure projects of improvements on rail throughout the country.
Colleagues, thank you. Order. Urgent question. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State to respond to an urgent question of which I've given prior notice?
Secretary of State Julian Smith. First of all, Mr. Speaker, can I thank the right honourable gentleman for his constructive work over the summer on a range of issues, including the issue at Harland and Wolff. And secondly, could I remind members that I have been held captive in the Whip's office for over 3 years. This is therefore my first dispatch box appearance, but I have to be honest, I'm very grateful not to be currently the government's chief whip. As is my duty under the Northern Ireland Executive Formation Act 2019, I will publish a report on or before the 9th of October to update on progress. Throughout the period ahead, I will be doing everything I can to support and encourage talks to succeed. Democratically elected politicians in Northern Ireland are best placed to take the decisions needed to support hospitals, schools and the police. I've seen the excellent work of civil servants in Northern Ireland over the last few weeks, but they cannot, of course, take the proactive decisions that are needed on public services or the economy in the run-up to the 31st of October. If we cannot secure the restoration of an executive, we will pursue the decision-making powers that are needed at the earliest opportunity.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I begin, obviously, by welcoming the Secretary of State to his role and his appearance at the dispatch box. He will know that Northern Ireland is in a unique position in the United Kingdom. It has no devolved government, nor does the Secretary of State or any member of the UK government have powers to deliver the kinds of transformation that's needed. And I know from my own conversations with senior members of the Northern Ireland Civil Service that they are frustrated by their inability to make the decisions, whether it be on health and education or, of course, on issues that we now face that Northern Ireland so desperately needs. Now, within that context, Mr. Speaker, we now face the prorogation of Parliament. We face the possibility, and accept this possibility, of a no-deal Brexit, of a general election coming fast down the track. The Executive Functions Act will expire sometime in October. Within that context, I have a number of very specific questions I need to put to the Secretary of State about the good governance of Northern Ireland. And the first, obviously, examines the question of prorogation. We know we face the possibility of prorogation next week. We know that that does place enormous challenges in terms of governance. Yes, if we can see Stormont back in operation, that will achieve what we need. But can I ask the Secretary of State very specifically, does he accept that there are real dangers during a period of prorogation in terms of governance of Northern Ireland? And can he tell the House precisely when he was consulted about prorogation, and can he tell the House what advice he gave to the Prime Minister and to other members of the government? If I can turn, Mr. Speaker, to the question of a no-deal Brexit, and if I can quote from the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who told the House just before the summer, "In the circumstances that the House voted for no deal, but in any case, if there were no deal, we, the government, would have to start formal engagement with the Irish government about providing strengthened decision-making in the event of that outcome, and that would include the very real possibility of imposing a form of direct rule." And the Foreign Secretary told the Today programme that direct rule would require legislation, and he made it quite clear that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland would need to follow this up. Mr. Speaker, does the Secretary of State accept that some form of direct governance, some form of direct accountability would be necessary in the event of a no-deal Brexit? And can he tell us what steps he's taken? And finally, Mr. Speaker, in any part of the United Kingdom, we expect the security of our people to be paramount. There are going to be some real questions about making sure that the PSNI has the resources it needs. Can he tell the House how he intends to make sure that the allocation of those resources ensures that the PSNI has the resource base and the numbers it needs? Mr. Speaker, if this were your constituency, if it Rochdale or Skipton and Ripon or Wales or Scotland, this situation would not be allowed to happen. I hope the Secretary of State shares with me the view that this cannot be allowed to frustrate and put Northern Ireland into a position of discomfort or worse.
The honourable gentleman asks about dangers. I mean, I think I've been very honest with the House. Powers are needed not only to ensure that the current situation where civil servants across Northern Ireland are making difficult decisions without political direction, but obviously in the run-up to either a deal or no deal, that the very tricky decisions can be made, and I'm sure those will have to be made at pace. He asked about the legal advice on prorogation. It was not something that I or my department was involved in. That was a matter for the Attorney-General. As Parliament is aware, the Cabinet was updated shortly before the decision was announced. On the issue of what happens if the talks don't succeed in time. Again, I've been clear, we need to have powers at the earliest opportunity, because I think some of the challenges that will emerge fairly soon. But we do have to operate in the environment governed by the Good Friday Agreement, you know, on that point, certainly in the discussions that I'm having with the Irish Foreign Secretary on the talks, the relationship is very positive. He asked about the PSNI. As he'll be aware, the government, the PSNI has gained from about £20 million additional expenditure. But again, when we look at how do we direct funding, how do we make those decisions, that's why I repeat, to ensure that a large part and a very important part of our country is not left ungoverned at a difficult time, we do need powers to be in place.
But in the name of expediting business, I appeal for extreme brevity. Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Speaker. I echo entirely the concerns of the Shadow Secretary of State. My right honourable friend, his commitment to Northern Ireland is not in question, but can I say to him that the impression coming out of some sections of government is that Northern Ireland can easily now be collateral damage. And could I ask him a specific question? He's referenced the legal advice from the attorney with regards to prorogation. He will have seen it. Was there specific reference to the unique and pressing needs of Northern Ireland and how that might be attenuated as the Prime Minister set out his strategy? And if not, why not?
Thank you, Dave. It would be obviously inappropriate to discuss the details of legal advice to this House, but suffice to say that I have indicated that in order to preserve the rights of citizens in Northern Ireland, we do need to get the executive up and running, get Stormont up and running, and in so failing ensure that there are powers in place to protect those rights, those jobs, the economy, and the commitments that have been made by both the Irish and the UK governments around the Good Friday Agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The impact of no deal on the devolved nations has been well documented, with Northern Ireland in particular risk due to the border. And the reports that his government are trying to roll back from its 2017 joint report commitments are deeply concerning. So does UK government not see that this particular game of brinkmanship that the Prime Minister is playing could have catastrophic consequences for the people of Northern Ireland? And will he now commit to ensure that no deal is taken off the table? In moments like this, press home more clearly than ever the need for Northern Ireland to have a functioning legislature. What progress has been made over the summer to ensure that Stormont is reconvened at the earliest opportunity? And finally, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said he had not decided to prorogue Parliament. Well, in reality, we now learn from evidence in the court session in Scotland that he had already signed off on prorogation in his red box. So can the Secretary of State tell us why there is such a disconnect between the Prime Minister's words and his actions?
Great questions.
Well, on the issue of deal versus no deal, it's my job to lead the efforts for Northern Ireland to prepare for no deal, but I couldn't be clearer in my mind that a deal is in the best interests of Northern Ireland. On talks, we've issued the report which outlines what has occurred over the summer. These have been at differing pace throughout the summer. There have been good talks. The issues are important but not insolvable. And I again pay tribute to Simon Coveney and officials for the work that has taken place over the summer to get us to a point where we are not far from the finishing line if the parties want to push forward.
Karen Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Shadow Secretary of State in expressing concerns about the impact prorogation may have on the people of Northern Ireland? And can I ask my right honourable friend, who I welcome to his place and wish him every success, but can he ensure that while prorogation is in place, government does not stop working for those that need redress? And by that I mean the victims of historical institutional sexual abuse and those that were severely physically and psychologically disabled in the Troubles through no fault of their own. They need redress, they need it urgently. Can the Secretary of State assure me he will deliver that?
Mr. Speaker, can I first of all just pay tribute to my predecessor, the Right Honourable Lady for Staffordshire Moorlands, who did an exceptional job as Secretary of State. She will know the trauma that victims have been under. 3 years now since the Hart report. The work she did to ensure that the bill is in a place that we can now present it at the earliest opportunity. And I hope that in the Queen's speech we will get it in and we will ensure that we solve this issue and solve it once and for all.
David Hanson.
In the absence of Stormont government and in the potential difficulties with no deal, could the Secretary of State just clarify who is going to take decisions in that period and what discussions he's had with both the political parties but also the Irish government on the implications of direct rule?
I strongly believe that getting the talks up and running, getting Stormont up and running is in the best interests of Northern Ireland and is the best route for decision making. Obviously, I'm looking with Cabinet colleagues about alternatives should that fail, but we have to try and get Stormont up and running.
Mr. David Lidington.
Mr. Speaker, in welcoming my right honourable friend to his responsibilities, would he agree that it would be frankly unconscionable for any government to lead us into a no-deal Brexit in which the Northern Ireland Civil Service lacked the legal powers and authority to cope with those circumstances? And does this not point for the need for the legislation to be introduced and enacted before the end of October?
I do think it is vital that first and foremost we get the talks up and running. If that doesn't work, we do get the powers in place to ensure that we are making all of the decisions in the best possible way for the citizens of Northern Ireland.
Nigel Dodds.
Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Secretary of State, indeed all his ministerial team, to their places, and we look forward to working with them in the days and weeks ahead. And can I also reiterate our commitment to getting Stormont up and running as quickly as possible, but I welcome the concentration on the need for direct power decision-making powers to be taken in the event that that's not possible. I think that's extremely important. As the Shadow Secretary of State has said, Northern Ireland cannot be left uniquely in this terrible position of having no one in charge in these critical days. Can the Secretary of State also welcome the publication and the remarks of the Foreign Minister of the Irish Republic yesterday, in which he indicated that in the event of a no deal there will be no checks or infrastructure in the border? That's very, very well. We should build on that, in that there is room for progress to get a deal, which we all want.
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his kind remarks. Thankfully, the EU negotiations are not my responsibility, but I do think, again, that a deal is in the best interest of Northern Ireland.
Single sentence, I think. Owen Patterson.
Mr. Speaker, everybody in this House supports the Belfast Agreement. Everybody in this House would like to see the institutions up and running again. We cannot bludgeon one party into cooperating. In the meantime, outcomes are deteriorating for our fellow citizens. The Bengoa report was published October 2016. Will he, while he's looking at this, look at what powers he could take to benefit every citizen in Northern Ireland?
I thank my right honourable friend. Visiting hospitals, visiting schools, he's absolutely right that for too long public servants have been having to make decisions that politicians should have been. I have to be frank with the House. The powers I have, the powers that are available for decision making, are extremely limited. And that's why I think we need to get Stormont up and running as a priority.
Lady Herman, single sentence, I think.
Of course, Mr. Speaker.
That's it. That's it.
The Secretary of State, to whom I give very warm congratulations upon his appointment and thanks to his predecessor, the Secretary of State will know from the very angry and concerned representations I've already made to his office that I am extremely concerned and annoyed that a statutory instrument which governs the appointments, key appointments across Northern Ireland to a range of bodies, including QCs, has been put in jeopardy by prorogation. So I need a commitment, a guarantee today from the Secretary of State that that statutory instrument will come through this House for its debate on Monday or Tuesday, but certainly before prorogation. It affects people's lives in Northern Ireland. He has a responsibility to protect those lives.
I hope to move the statutory instrument early next week.
David Gore.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear from what my right honourable friend is saying that in order, assuming that we have a no-deal Brexit and that Stormont isn't up and running, that in order to protect the rights of the people of Northern Ireland, we need to take powers. In order to take powers, we need to legislate. And in order to legislate, this House needs to be sitting. Is it not clear, Mr. Speaker, that if this House does not get the legislation through because it is prorogued or dissolved by the end of October, that the rights of the people of Northern Ireland will be detrimentally affected?
Well, I think, again, the priority has to be on getting Stormont up and running. I've been honest and open to the House about the need for powers, and clearly my right honourable friend is right that at the very heart of the need for those powers are the rights of citizens in Northern Ireland.
Ian Paisley, sentence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Is the Secretary of State sickened already by people talking up the dangers, almost cheerleading and willing on the problems instead of actually trying to find and help find solutions? When will the Secretary of State be able to bring forward a report or a bill on institutional historical abuse cases, which was promised before the recess?
Secretary of State. I hope we'll be introducing in the coming weeks.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Will the Secretary of State confirm that there are no circumstances, including a no-deal Brexit, under which the British government would erect a hard border on the island of Ireland?
We are fully committed to no hard border on, between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
Jim Shannon, one sentence.
Mr. Speaker, I'll do that. In the Sunday papers at the weekend, there was indications that the dissident Republicans had contacted experienced bomb makers from the IRA to make a spectacular big bomb. Can I ask the Secretary of State, what has been done to prevent dissident Republicans making contact with the bomb makers to ensure those bombs never happen in Northern Ireland or anywhere in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
I'm afraid I missed my honourable friend the start of his question, but it's true to say that the PSNI and security services have done an exceptional job over the summer. I'd like to pay tribute to them and to their families, Mr. Speaker, because people are trying to kill them, and that is on the increase, certainly over the summer. And I have decided to convene a security meeting on a weekly basis, including the PSNI, to make sure over the coming weeks and months that I am appraised on a regular basis and meeting those people that are leading these teams, putting their lives on the line.
Fantastic work this week. Sir Henry Bellingham.
Mr. Speaker, in congratulating the new Secretary of State, can I ask him what he plans to do about stopping the relentless hounding of army and police veterans in respect of alleged historic crimes when most of the evidence has disappeared? What's he going to do about it?
So, as my right honourable friend will have seen from the report that we laid yesterday and from the comments that the Prime Minister has made, there has been a new cross-government effort to ensure that we look at this issue. I know that he has raised this issue many times in this House, and I hope that he welcomes the fact that the government accepts the current situation is not working, and that we need to relook and revisit this area, and I and a number of my right honourable friends in the Cabinet are doing so, and look forward to reporting to this House in due course.
I remind colleagues of the single sentence imperative. Wes Streeting.
Given the unique challenges that prorogation or dissolution presents the Northern Ireland office, why wasn't the Secretary of State consulted by the Prime Minister or Dominic Cummings before the prorogation plan was agreed?
As I said, the Cabinet was updated immediately before the decision. You would have to ask others on the first part of your question.
Nigel Mills.
Service were clear that a decision to extend the welfare mitigation package was needed this autumn, whereas they'd have to start taking alternative measures to advise Northern Ireland recipients of those on what action they should take. Has the Secretary of State got a plan to extend the welfare mitigations in the near future?
So my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, was in Northern Ireland last week, and I continue to work with her, and she is actively involved on looking at the issue of welfare, not only in the GB but across Northern Ireland.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, does he agree that the actions of the Labour Party yesterday in forcing through the pro-EU, anti-democratic surrender bill will make it more difficult for the government to reach an agreement with the EU and therefore produce a situation in which direct rule is likely? And will he give an assurance that he will not shy away from the decision which should have, quite frankly, been made a long time ago?
Right.
Well, I think we have to focus on getting a deal, Mr. Speaker, for Northern Ireland, and that is my priority in supporting the Prime Minister, and that is his priority. I think again, let's get Stormont up and running. That solves many of the issues that we're concerned about today.
My apologies to the right honourable gentleman for Old Bexley and Sidcup, because if I'd seen him earlier, I would have called him earlier, but it's a pleasure to call him now. James Brakenshire.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his appointment and the privilege to serve in office, and wish him all success with his role. He highlighted in his written statement yesterday of the need to intensify negotiations with the parties. That is the way to avoid legislation being needed. Perhaps he could set out what form he expects that to take.
We've, as I mentioned to the House earlier, we've been having good discussions over the summer. I met with the Irish Foreign Minister last Friday and we'll be meeting again this Friday, and I hope with him to push forward on working with the parties to get into a position where we've got the best possible opportunity to get Stormont up and running.
Thank you. Ruth Jones.
We heard from the Minister for the member for North Down yesterday about the Prime Minister's failure to meet with the Taoiseach to date. So what engagement on prorogation has there been with the Irish Government in their capacity as co-guarantors under the Good Friday Agreement?
I meet regularly with the Irish Foreign Minister, but I have not discussed the issue of prorogation.
Maria Caulfield.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend to his place. I'm pleased to say he's committed to legislation for victims of institutional abuse being in the Queen's speech. Can he commit that that legislation will come to this place before the end of the year?
Yes, I can.
Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If we prorogue and then move to dissolution and Stormont still isn't sitting, what will happen to the provisions of the Northern Irish Bill that repeal sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act after the 22nd of October?
Those provisions remain.
Craig Whittaker.
Speaker, Northern Ireland just this week has received over £400 million extra in the spending review. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the people of Northern Ireland will get far better value for money from that money for all areas of spending by having the Assembly up and running?
My honourable friend is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. £400 million, but we need a political decision-making body, the executive, to make sure that is best directed in the best interest of Northern Ireland citizens.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State's former boss instigated a review into the Home Office forcing British identity on those who identify as Irish, such as Emma de Souza, back in February. Can the Secretary of State advise the House, has his new boss binned that review? If not, why not, and when will he publish it?
It's vital that this House continues to respect and to ensure that the dual citizenship components that he talks about is preserved. The review is taking place, and I've made strong representations, and the government is fully committed to the Good Friday Agreement obligations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister says a hard border can be avoided by the use of existing technology. So can the Secretary explain what technology can check passports, visas and customs arrangements for goods without as much as a camera at the border?
Mr. Speaker, the government is fully committed, as is the Irish government, to the common travel area in all deal and no deal scenarios.
Thank you. Order. Yes, well, as it appertains to the matters of which we've just treated, I will take it if it's brief. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say that the Secretary of State was very candid in his admission that he wasn't consulted about prorogation. Now, important decisions have to be made about Northern Ireland's governance over this period. Can we have a clear statement, perhaps from the Prime Minister or from wherever, that there will be time either before prorogation or at a convenient time for this House, so the Secretary of State has the power to do the things that Northern Ireland needs?
To respond? He doesn't wish to respond. OK, well, I will come to the honourable gentleman. The point of order has been heard. It isn't a matter for adjudication by the Chair, but I think that the concern, I want to say to the Secretary of State, the concern that has been expressed on both sides of the House, including by a number of former Northern Ireland secretaries on this matter, will have registered very firmly with the right honourable gentleman, and about this matter more must be heard ere long. I think we need to be absolutely crystal clear on that point. Nothing can get in the way of the provision of proper information to this House on this matter, as the Chair of the Select Committee and many others have emphasised. I don't think anybody should think that that can be averted. It can't be, and it won't be. Point of order, Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of members have taken to naming a senior public official civil service rank from time to time, not only in this question time but also in debates. I was under the impression, Mr. Speaker, perhaps you can correct me, that to name a public servant in that way is actually out of order and is wrong and should be avoided. Is that the case, or what are the rules regarding naming and trying to shame public officials in this way?
Courteous reference is the guiding principle. The notion that no public servant can be referred to is not correct. It is an interesting concept on the part of the honourable gentleman, but there is no track record on that matter. Thank you. We come now to the statement by the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, in respect of which, again, there is a premium upon brevity. Secretary of State Robert Jenrick.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I wish to take this early opportunity as Secretary of State to update the House on the Government's progress on building safety and to set out this administration's approach. 2 years on from the Grenfell tragedy, it remains our priority to ensure that we have a building safety system that people can trust. Taking on this role, I've been very mindful of my responsibility to the bereaved and survivors of that tragedy. We must support them to recover and rebuild their lives. And in this, I'm pleased to say that we have the continued support of my right honourable friend, the member for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, as Minister for Grenfell victims. I'm determined to play my part in their pursuit of answers and justice, and to ensure that all residents of high-rise buildings are safe, feel safe, now and into the future. My predecessors have tackled this work with great commitment and integrity. Having reviewed these matters since my appointment, it's clear to me that we must go further and at pace if we're to ensure that building safety is the system that we all want to see it. I want to update the House this morning accordingly on actions that I intend to take immediately. Firstly, I'm consulting on changes to fire safety regulations for new build blocks of flats. We will seek to commit to requiring sprinkler systems as standard in a wider range of new flats. I'm minded to reduce the height at which those sprinklers are required down to 18 metres. I'm open to hearing evidence for other relevant thresholds, and I will be led by the evidence wherever that takes us. We'll also consult on requiring better signs and evacuation alert systems to support effective firefighting. In this respect, I'm grateful to the National Fire Chiefs Council and to London Fire Brigade for their valuable and continuing contributions. I've also published a summary of responses to our call for evidence on a full review of the technical requirements in approved document B. There will likely be additional changes in due course, and when taking these decisions, we'll also always be led by the evidence and residents' safety. I will keep the industry and Parliament informed. Secondly, with respect to the Building a Safer Future consultation, I intend to respond by the end of the year and to legislate at the earliest possible opportunity. I believe we should establish a new building safety regulator to oversee the new regulatory regime for buildings. But again, it's clear to me that we need to act now. So we're working with the Health and Safety Executive to use their experience to set up the regulator in shadow form prior to new legislation. And I want to see this happen as soon as practicable. During the autumn, we'll take further decisions on the regulator's long-term functions and structure, and again, I'll update the House accordingly. Thirdly, it's clear that although the answer to the concerns of residents is the establishment of the new safety case regime under the legislation to come, with the individual assessment of buildings envisaged by Dame Judith Hackett, we should not wait until then to act. The Home Secretary and I have worked with the National Fire Chiefs Council and intend to establish a new protection board. This will provide expert and consistent inspections across the country to ensure that we are identifying, managing and properly recording risks. This will significantly increase the pace of inspection activity across high-rise residential and other high-risk buildings to make sure that building owners are acting on the very latest safety advice. I expect all high-rise buildings to have been inspected or insured by the time the new building safety regime is in place, or no later than 2021. Residents of these buildings should be swiftly informed of the results of these assessments and inspections, and of course, any changes acted upon as soon as possible. Improved inspection activity will be informed by the current data collection work of local authorities for non-ACM high-rise buildings. And today, to support that work, I'm pleased to confirm that we're providing them with £4 million of additional funding. I can also confirm that my department will provide £10 million per year of additional funding to local authorities to help them improve their inspection capabilities and to support the work that we're now launching of the Protection Board. Should the Board consider it necessary, I will of course consider providing additional resources during the remainder of this financial year to increase the pace of inspection and assurance work. I hope the systematic inspection programme will provide reassurance to residents across the country, many of whom I understand have legitimate concerns. Finally, Mr. Speaker, on our ongoing work to support the remediation of dangerous ACM cladding on buildings where it poses a clear risk. In May, the government made funding available for its removal from eligible buildings in the private residential sector, in addition to funds already available for the social sector, bringing the total to £600 million. As of the 12th of September, eligible private sector building owners will now be able to formally submit their applications for funding for ACM removal and replacement. They have until the end of December to apply. There is no excuse for building owners to delay. My department has been encouraging swift applications. We now have a direct relationship with a named individual in the United Kingdom for each relevant building. Where we receive applications, we'll do everything we can to turn them around rapidly, prioritising and considering responses on a rolling basis. Let me be clear, Mr. Speaker, inaction will have consequences. I will name and shame those individuals and businesses if I see inaction during the course of the autumn. If we reach the end of the autumn and building owners have not responded and do not have exceptional reasons for this, I will take whatever steps and sanctions are necessary. I will support local authorities to take robust enforcement action against reluctant building owners, and I've asked the Joint Inspection Team to provide them with all necessary advice. Failure to act, particularly now that the funding is provided by the taxpayer, would be, frankly, disgraceful. And I hope and know that colleagues in this House will share this determination. Where members have ACM-clad buildings in their constituencies, we will provide guidance on how they can encourage building owners to apply. And my department stands ready to advise on the contact that we've had already. With regard to non-ACM cladding, the research programme began in April 2019 and scheduled testing has now been concluded. Findings will be published in the autumn. Following the full report, the expert panel will consider if further testing should be commissioned or existing advice supplemented. They anticipate publishing any such additional advice by the end of this year. In the interim, building owners should continue to follow the very clear steps set out in Advice Note 14 to ensure the safety of their buildings and their residents. Mr. Speaker, the safety of people in their homes must be paramount. I hope the House will welcome the measures I've laid out today to ensure that no one should feel unsafe in their home, and that we build a safety system that people across this country can trust. I commend this statement to the House.
Healy. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for the advance copy of his statement. I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I admire his air of calm. This is a government of chaos. Even the Prime Minister's brother has walked out of office this morning. So I recognise that his presence here is at least welcome. I recognise the good intent he has to make good on the failings of his predecessors over the last few years. But why, Mr. Speaker, 2 years and 3 months after that terrible Grenfell tragedy, are 324 high-rise blocks still cloaked in the same dangerous Grenfell-style cladding? And why have 72 private block owners not even got a plan in place to fix the problem? So will he do what his predecessors did not, which is to bring in Labour's 5-point plan to force the pace of this recladding? Name and shame those private block owners now, not sometime in the future. Set a hard deadline for block owners to get the work done. Update the sanctions available to councils under the Housing Act 2004. Make government funding available for cladding remediation on private blocks where they have to do the work, and widen now the government-sponsored testing regime to comprehensively test all suspect non-ACM cladding. Mr. Speaker, 1 year and 4 months after the final Hackett report was published, why no comprehensive implementation plan? Why no legislation? Today he confirms his intention to respond by the end of the year. Can he do better? Can he guarantee, and will he guarantee, that legislation to implement the much-needed legal changes will be part of the Queen's speech promised next month? And Mr. Speaker, 10 months after the government's contract for this wider testing was due to be completed, that report has still not been completed and published. So will he undertake to publish in full and without delay, not sometime in the autumn, those results in full? Mr. Speaker, we welcome the consultation on extending the requirement for sprinklers in new build flats. It builds on the provisions we brought in as a government for high-rise blocks. But will he go a step further? Will he do what we have planned and pledged, which is to set up a fund so that we can retrofit all high-rise social housing blocks so that people who live in them can be assured that they are safe in the future? And finally, I welcome also his plans for a new inspection system. But why on earth does he say that all high-risk buildings may not be inspected until 2021? Mr. Speaker, that's 2 years in the future. That's 4 years after Grenfell. And what is he doing to speed that up? Mr. Speaker, this was a national tragedy. People look to the government in such times for a national response. And I have to say, at every stage, this has been a government too slow to grasp the scale of the problems. The action it has taken has been too little, too late. And I regret to say there is too little in today's statement that gives us confidence that this is a Secretary of State and this is a government that can rectify its failings to act as it should to make everyone safe after that terrible Grenfell tragedy more than 2 years ago.
Secretary of State. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm grateful for the comments from the Right Honourable Gentleman. He and I have worked well together on other issues, and I hope we can on this issue, which should be beyond party politics. We have done a very large number of steps. My predecessors have worked with commitment on this issue. We've given clear advice to building owners who must take personal responsibility. We've introduced a ban on combustible cladding. We've had the independent review by Dame Judith Hackett, which is now concluded. We've had the consultation, which we'll be responding to by the end of this year. We now have 150 individuals working in my department on building safety, many with decades of experience on this issue, working again with great commitment and at pace. We've put £600 million of public money behind remediation of dangerous ACM cladding in the social sector, and of which £200 million is now available in the private sector. We've of course launched the full public inquiry with respect to the Grenfell tragedy, and the first phase of that is expected to report back shortly, of course the timing of which is up to the judge. We've issued clarified building regulations guidance. We're increasing support for local authorities. Today I'm announcing, as I say, £10 million for the Protection Board and £4 million directly for local authorities. And we've removed a range of substandard products already from the market. Is there more to do? Of course, and I hope that honourable members across the House will see from the statement that I've just made the number of steps that I intend to make and the pace at which I want my department to be working in the months to come. He speaks about funding. Well, we've made the funding available, and I share his determination to hold those private sector owners of buildings to account. As I said in my remarks, I will be naming and shaming the individuals and the companies who own those buildings if they don't take action very quickly this autumn. And if we come to the end of the fund in December, he asked for a hard deadline. Well, that is a hard deadline. If there are buildings that have not been remediated, or at least that applications have not been put in for the fund, and there isn't an exceptional reason for that, then we will take whatever steps are required to enforce them at that point. We will work with local authorities to make sure that they robustly use their powers, and there are instances where they are, and we are working with them already. The Hackett review was an important step forward. This is a complex area, and all of us, I think, want to ensure that we get this right. So we do need to work through the responses to the consultation very carefully. My department is doing that, and we'll bring forward the legislation, as I've said, at the very earliest opportunity, and he has my assurance that I will certainly be working within government to ensure and to impress upon the Prime Minister and others that this is a piece of legislation that needs to come forward at the earliest opportunity. I don't think it's something that should be rushed, and it's for that reason that I've worked with the Home Secretary to bring in this interim measure that the Protection Board will be established, and those individual assessments of buildings will begin as soon as possible once that's been established, and that will provide reassurance to residents. I share his concern that time is passing, and I hope he'll see that I do intend to be working at considerable pace to get this done. With respect to sprinklers, well, we're consulting now on the building regulations guidance so that they can come into force, or whatever is deemed to be the appropriate threshold. As I said, our preference is 18 metres, but we're open to evidence in other respects. As regards retrofitting of sprinklers on existing high-rise buildings, well, Dame Judith Hackett and other expert advisors to us have made very clear that that is not always the right option for a building. It may well be, but there are also other measures that could be taken instead, which might be more appropriate for an individual building. And Dame Judith Hackett made clear that it was wise to proceed on an individual basis. So the safety regime that we'll be introducing in legislation will ensure that there are individual assessments of buildings. They may conclude the requirement to retrofit sprinklers, but they might have alternative arrangements instead. We'll obviously ensure that whatever is proposed in those assessments happens in a timely fashion.
Order. Again, I appeal for extreme brevity on the part of colleagues who, if they don't provide it, will have to be cut off, I'm afraid. Bob Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wrote to the Secretary of State on Monday about the position of my constituency in North Point in Bromley. I welcome his announcement. Will he confirm that the establishment of a protection board ought to and must be used to avoid the need that people like those have of having to go through the rigmarole of commissioning a building survey to prove eligibility for the fund and then trying to apply for funding from the pre-application fund, which has a portal which wasn't live at the beginning of this week. We need to cut through that immediately.
Well, he and I have corresponded and spoken about the issue in his constituency. As I've said in my correspondence to him, I would encourage the building owners in his constituency to apply to the fund. It will be open on the 12th of September. We will be handling the applications on a rolling basis. In fact, it will also be possible to get a refund retrospectively, so you could get on with the work immediately and seek the funding at a later date. He also asked me previously about those buildings where there may be a mix of ACM cladding and other forms of cladding. Public money will obviously be spent for remediation of the dangerous ACM cladding, but if it is proven that it is impossible to remediate the ACM cladding without taking off the other forms of cladding, then obviously that may well be it may well be possible to use public money to fund that as well. But I hope he will put in an application, or his constituents will put in an application as soon as possible, and we can move forward at pace in his constituency.
Alison Thielis.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome the Secretary of State to his place. But I do agree that he's not quite moving fast enough, and we do owe it to all those who lost their lives and survived at Grenfell to do more, and to do more quickly here. The Scottish Ministerial Working Group is already way ahead of where the UK Government is at on this, and are moving forward with recommendations. In Scotland, we're looking at 11 metres rather than the 18 metres he recommends, so I ask if he has spoken to his counterpart in the Scottish Government, and if we'll look at the evidence that Scotland took on making it 11 metres rather than 18 to have mandatory sprinklers in high-rises. We're also looking at regulations around new builds and having two forms of escape stairs and sound alerts in new builds as well. Will he look at those? We're looking at compliance plans for high-risk buildings also, and in strengthening enforcement. Can I ask, because he hasn't mentioned, what has been the advice following the fire in Barking regarding thermowood and similar cladding on low-rise buildings, because it's clear that there needs to be some advice and regulation on that as well.